everybody. Would you believe me if I said it was my birthday as well? It's not. I'm as Libra as they come, so. Yeah, hi. I am Gem Barton, as previously mentioned. Super excited to be here today. This is like my spiritual home, I think. I typically live in academic conferences where this many people would never attend a talk, so a little bit nervous, not gonna lie. I'm here today representing the Superfutures platform at the Royal College of Art, and I have with me my colleague Pierre, Shaw, and a handful of students. So whilst I'm up here, the work is to celebrate them and also many other students that are at home still. For those that don't know me, and I do see many familiar faces in the room, but for those that don't know me, I'm architecturally trained, so I trained as an architect in the UK, and I've been a spatial kind of educator and author for knocking on the door of 20 years now. My specialism, or has become my specialism, is what I call the spatializing of futures. So kind of the collision of futures thinking and the built environment. So trying to look at futures from an architectural perspective, but also trying to look at architecture from a futures perspective. And that's what I guess I do, and that's what the units that I teach tries to do. I want to introduce to you today my talk, which is called Rehearsing the Not-Yet. And I suppose it's something that I call, well, the pedagogy of the not-yet, which is kind of the teaching methodologies of something. The talk is about teaching, yes. It's about queering and queer theory, and it's about imagining otherwise. So it's always helpful, I think, at the start to give a kind of brief explanation of what queering means in this context. These are my words. My definition of it changes constantly, and that's kind of the point of queering, but we'll get to that. Beyond identity, to queer is to other. To queer is to question. To queer is to disrupt. To queer is to stretch, bend, reimagine, and reject inherited structures that no longer serve us, if they ever did. And so with that in mind, I guess for me, a constant question in my research is what does queering look like in a futures context and an architectural kind of context? So whilst I get a drink, you can have a look at this picture. So I have a provocation for you, and for the rest of the talk, I guess. What if being useful isn't the highest goal? What happens when we shift from training students for industry to preparing them for possibility? To be imaginative, resistant, and relational. What if the purpose of design education is not to be useful? Now, design education's kind of focus or trajectory into solution-focused teaching has its roots in kind of a post-war expansion of kind of modernist design thinking, right? And education became aligned with industry and progress. Neoliberal policies that prioritized free markets aligned it further with kind of economic outcomes. And the result is an education that's kind of centered on efficiency, employability, scalability. And for me, that's come, I guess, at the expense of an openness and a slowness and a focus on process-based learning rather than an outcome-based assessment. Now, the solution-driven approach is definitely suitable for many situations and many industries. But the problem stems, or it becomes a problem when it becomes the status quo, when it becomes the only option available and everybody is being taught the same. Because we've been training students to respond, to resolve, rather than to question or to critique or to imagine otherwise. And essentially what that's been doing is feeding our obsession with practicality. I can hear some of you thinking, but what's wrong with being practical? That's okay, isn't it? Yes. But if we're always seeking answers, it matters even more what are the questions. And if we're always seeking answers, it matters even more who's asking the questions. If we're always seeking answers, we end up designing for certainty and for speed and for proof. Because that's what practicality demands. It demands control and replication and predictability and evidence. And I could never say this as eloquently as Sabrina Meherily from Cause and Effect, and she says, practicality is a colonial demand rooted in the logistics of Western science. It requires control, predictability, and proof, dismissing complexity and emergence. And for me, it's the ways that education has become machined to train and grade that aligns us with this. And what I find most upsetting is education's alignment with those structures. Should we not be separate from these things rather than mimicking and feeding? Because the irony is that if practicality was all it was cracked up to be and delivering on its promises, would we be in the pickle that we find ourselves in? Wouldn't we already be in a better world? So perhaps it's time to stop asking what works and instead ask what matters. And this is where we can begin to lean on some queer theory for some structure and some support and some alliance. Queerness here is not about trend or aesthetic, because to queer something is to disrupt its assumptions, its logic, and its presumed ends. Queerness is political, it's ecological, it's refusal, it's resilience and resistance, it's survival. All of the things that the world could do with a little bit more of right now. Jack Halberstam taught us, or still teaches us, that queer time is non-linear, resists progress narratives, and it resists productivity traps. And I find myself thinking, well, what does that mean for pedagogy? What does that mean for teaching? What's left for education, or today's education, if we remove progress and productivity as a measure? Well, it means that we can hold space for delay and for doubt and for risk, not as like bugs in the system, but as vital features, because life is full of delay and doubt and risk. And if our ideas don't feel a little bit absurd, then maybe we're not doing enough. Maybe, as Rob Hopkins once said, if it doesn't sound ridiculous, maybe it's not ambitious enough. And one reason why I think that we don't, or we're struggling to exercise our imagination, perhaps as far as we could at times, is that the words that we have and the language that we use isn't enough. You know, we're bound by the limits of our language, both in what we say and in what we think. Foucault gives us this quote, language is not merely a system of communication, but also a system of thought, and thus it limits the way in which we can think and understand the world. And as someone working within and beyond academia, I often find myself needing new words and new terms to describe and articulate the things that I want. or the things that the students are doing, because the existing words, the existing lexicon doesn't feel right, doesn't feel enough, passionate enough or wide enough. It doesn't accurately describe the intention. But also because I don't necessarily think what we're doing wants to be mistaken for something else. And it's not just a personal urge, it's a pedagogic urge for me. How can we invite students to invent new worlds and new terms if we're not going to let those ideas take shape? Because new words allow new worlds. Generating your own words and your own language is too an act of queering. And I want to give you 2 examples of me doing this in my own work. Because I've also had to invent new words to describe what I'm doing. The first term is experimental realism. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a book of mine. Plug. But it was also used briefly in social psychology. And it was a term that was used to describe how realistic a participant in a social experiment found the experiment to be. Like, how well were they duped by the experiment that they were in? But in a design pedagogy context, it refers to design work that explores futures or imaginaries, but grounds them in embodied, in the material, in the political. It's speculative, but it's situated. It's real in its stakes and consequences, even if not in its literal form. Sorry, forgot the builds there. The second example came when I began to explore kind of futures frameworks. My guess is many of you recognize this. This is from Eliot Montgomery. He calls it an unresolved mapping of speculative design. And I love the fact that it's unresolved, because isn't everything, really? When I found this, I noticed something missing. And I wonder if there's something that you notice missing. If you can't see it, it's describing, I don't know if I've got a pointer, different fields of sort of speculative design. Can you spot anything glaringly absent? Yes, fantastic, okay. So I thought maybe he's made another one, and he did, version 2, also missing. And I thought to myself, well, how can arguably one of the oldest and longest serving design disciplines not be colliding with futures thinking here at all? So I went to see if I could find some more frameworks, any of them featuring architecture, and I could not. So please, if anybody knows one, hit me up afterwards. I'd love to see it. So yeah, architecture is missing. And for me, that's a really important observation. I'm obsessed with architecture. Architecture, the discipline, not architecture, the profession. For me, they're very separate things, and that's a topic for a whole other conversation. But I am obsessed about space because it is a medium that every single person, without exception, has experience of. But yet, the profession of architecture is not aligned with futures. And that's crucial, because despite the urgency of climate, housing, urban crises, list as many as you like, it's notably absent from mainstream futures work. And where it is present, it very rarely goes beyond like technological innovation in materials or construction techniques. So there's no better home for the application of futures thinking than the built environment, an industry which operates at a sloth-like pace and places much of its value and reputation on the success of its built form. Our cities are living and infinite. Today's buildings are designed based on the regulations of the past, with the singular, often economic needs of the present and little to no consideration of its futures. If I were to give you an example of this, I want you to think about a hospital, arguably a city's most important building, and which can take anywhere up to 10 years from conception to completion, from somebody starting to draw a design to somebody being in a hospital bed or on a ward. Yet nobody in that process is thinking about the future of care, or the future of disease, or the future of healing, or any of these things. As soon as the regulations that they're following kick into place, the design stops. I mean, futures thinking doesn't exist in an organized protocol or way at all in the architectural design process. It is not mandatory. It's not even mandatory in education. So, I took away some of the things in the diagram and I put architecture in. And when I put back in the other disciplines, I realized I'd sort of accidentally invented something, which is what I call speculative spatial design. It's a kind of subgenre of speculative design, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but that centers the spatial dimensions of futures. And this has become my research and kind of teaching specialism at the RCA, as well as my consulting practice. So what is it? It's the study and critique of emerging transitions and their relationships to space. It's placing space, the lived, navigated, and felt space, at the center of how we imagine, design, and rehearse the world to come. These new terms, experimental realism, speculative spatial design, whatever, they give shape to things that don't exist or easily in, they don't fit easily in pre-existing categories. They offer students and myself permission to design in those gray spaces in between, to dwell in the margins, and that's often where imagination really thrives. And it's this thinking that drives the philosophy of superfutures. And what I'm going to do next is play a short video. This is a showreel of student work from this year's cohort. Some of you may have seen the exhibition in the Garden Gallery already. If you haven't, please go afterwards. It's a current project that we're working on, and it's a collaboration with the UK Government Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. It was a collaboration set up to inspire and advocate for radical thinking that directly engages with climate and environmental policy challenges. Everything that you see, and actually everything you've seen so far in the presentation, the visuals, are all student work. And it's exploring the changing relationships between nature and trade. Our primary tool is filmmaking for lots of different reasons. And we're using it here to explore the spatial, behavioral, and planetary parameters and conditions of supply chains. So, imagine a world where the surface of the ocean becomes a border, a place of regulation, consent, and territorial lines, just like the boundaries we draw between nations. A place where entering the sea means asking for permission, not from coast guards, but from the water and its inhabitants. Imagine a world where anti-LGBT+ views run so deep they don't just target queer humans, but spill over into the animal kingdom, where fox hunting for the elite transforms into seahorse hunting, a dystopian kind of queer pest control. Can you imagine a world where karma is a visible metric, a public score that governs your access and your worth? Or where blood plasma becomes a currency? Or where every connection between humans and non-humans alike is filtered through the stars of a mandatory birth chart? These visions aren't prophecies, but provocations, and they come out of our experimental pedagogy from Superfutures, a research-led, speculative, spatial design platform at the Royal College of Art. We operate at the edge of design, planning, policy, and storytelling, a place where spatial designers don't just draw buildings, they draw futures. We reimagine society and its rituals, embodying the characters we design for and with. One of our current explorations is called Nature's Depot, a research-led futures project in collaboration with DEFRA, the UK's Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Here our students trace the landscapes of supply chains, real ones, before rewriting their timelines, asking what happens when policy changes, when nature and trade continue to collide, and when film becomes the medium of speculation. The results are more than just films, they're tools, accessible, emotional, spatial tools that invite public engagement and shape new design dialogues. Through speculative sets, imagined policies, performative design, our students question the rigidity of traditional representation, education, and imagination. Design isn't a fixed and measurable science, not a plan or a section, but a plurality, or a plurality of pluralities. Superfutures doesn't promise utopias, but it offers many futures. We are rehearsing the not-yet, so that we might make more thoughtful decisions about the spaces we share and the worlds we are yet to build. Layered, conflicting, coexisting. Like I say, I'm just the representative. The work is very much all theirs. I see that I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead a couple of slides to this. For us and for our teaching, we see the studio as a speculative stage, as a theatre of possibilities, not just a space of output and production. We want to shift the focus from product to practice, and from certainty to care. These pedagogic tools allow us to reframe what counts as valid work, valuable process, or worthwhile speculation. When imagination is the ambition, the studio becomes a rehearsal space, a place where dreaming is legitimate labor. When ambiguity is cherished, students learn to sit with uncertainty, embrace complexity, and design without fixed endpoints. Here, the brief is not the end, but the beginning of unfolding futures. And speaking of briefs, every year I introduce the brief to the students in a way that I hope fosters a camaraderie of sorts. You know, as educators, we ask our students to be vulnerable with us, to share ideas they're not sure about, to expose themselves to critique and to tutorials. And I find that one of the best ways to ground that experience to start with is to be vulnerable with them too. So each year, the brief is introduced as a poem, which is not just embarrassing to read out loud to 100 students. I'd say it's 1,000,000 times more embarrassing to read out to a room full of you, but I'm going to do it anyway. So this was written by myself and my colleague Pierre, and it's called Nature's Depot. So, snowball, domino, butterfly effect. From socks to seaweed, all things they connect. Your actions, reactions, feeding the trade, legal or not, that money's getting made. Consume, extract, consume some more. Shipping containers, pallets, straight to the store. Goods, services, ideas, even people. Everything has a price, because nothing is equal. Stop though, think, just for a minute. Fires, floods, they're bad, however you spin it. Stories, myths, fact and fiction. Futures has no limits, through definition. With your help, I'll take the wager. She'll come out on top. She's Mother Nature. My final point is that preferable futures require empathy. And empathy is wholly and purely an act of imagination and design. To put yourself in someone else's shoes, you have to be able to imagine something other than yourself, right? You have to be able to imagine someone else's perspective. So if we are not an imaginative society, we are probably also not an empathic one. That's the end.